Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our philosophy material. This is a lecture on ethics, and in particular, the approach to ethics known as consequentialism. The two most commonly discussed forms of consequentialist ethics are egoism and utilitarianism, and these are often discussed for good reason. Many people have consequentialist moral intuitions. We see, as I've said elsewhere, consequentialist moral intuitions play out in things like superhero movies, discussions about war, lots of other contexts in media and even in everyday life where people express the intuition that we should always perform the action that helps the greatest number of people. So it's very intuitively plausible approach to ethics. The other very well-known approach to ethics that's consequentialist is egoism. And egoism is quite different from utilitarianism, but they're both consequentialist. Egoism, again, is the view that you should always do what's best for you. And I think it's worth saying a little bit about egoism, especially given that egoism seems to be almost a more resurgent view about ethics. Maybe it's a sign of our times. Maybe it's because other moral theories have not lived up to their promise. But suffice it to say, egoism and utilitarianism are both utility-based action guiding normative moral theories. And as always, I would encourage you to look at the chapters that are assigned for greater context. So let's get into it. So again, to review normative ethical theories, we as philosophers typically distinguish between action-based and agent-based. As was just mentioned, consequentialism is an approach to ethics that focuses on actions and whether or not those actions produce certain kinds of consequences. So this is opposed to deontological approaches to ethics, which look at the action themselves. Whereas in consequentialism, we think that an action is good or bad because of the consequences it produces. So utilitarianism has two well-known subcategories: rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. As I just mentioned, deontology is also an action-based moral theory, but it is a theory that looks at specific kinds of actions and the motives that you have for performing them. So the two most well-known versions of deontological ethics are divine command theory and Kantian deontology, which will be discussed in another lecture. And opposing action-based, I shouldn't say opposing, but not focused on action-based, we have agent-based ethical theories. And the main version of that is virtue ethics in both the Aristotelian, Confucian, and other versions. Okay, so as I mentioned, the basics of consequentialism entail, in its broadest sense, that our actions are right or wrong because and only because of their consequences. So consequentialists interpret the results of actions by the value of the action's results. What is it? Consequentialists disagree on what exactly those values are. Consequentialism, described generally, does not say what the good is, but if we look much more closely at individual versions of consequentialism, they will tell us what the good is that should be achieved. And for utilitarianism, hence the name, it's usually utility. The most common value is happiness or pleasure. And to motivate consequentialism and utilitarianism, we first of all want to be charitable, but also it seems to be very intuitive to a lot of people that the thing that we as humans seek out or should want to maximize is happiness or pleasure. I mean, what else do we seek? Regardless of whether we care about money or family or love, all these things, it's safe to say for utilitarians, lead to happiness or pleasure, whether it's pleasure we get from food or travel or even bodily pleasures. They're still pleasures. So we often seek pleasure. So one of the initial appeals to consequentialism, I think it's fair to say, is just how intuitive and simple this approach to ethics is. If ethics isn't about consequences, what else could it be? So there's a broad appeal to consequentialism for a lot of people, understandably. So again, utilitarianism is a specific kind of consequentialism. You can be a consequentialist without being a utilitarian, right? Egoism is another form of consequentialist, but it's safe to say that utilitarianism is the most well-known version of consequentialist ethics. And utilitarianism represents a complete theory, and it's certainly been developed over many centuries by some very famous and thoughtful people. Utilitarianism focuses on happiness, right? Utility. It takes happiness or well-being to be the only thing that is good in and of itself or valuable for its own sake. And in terms of individualism, this notion of goodness or the good attaches to individuals, humans, and perhaps other sentient beings, and nothing beyond that. So we don't ascribe, happiness to my pencil or my, the book right next to me, because that's not something that seeks or can value pleasure. But certainly humans and even non-human animals do. So this is another point in utilitarians' favor, is that they were some of the first ethical theorists to suggest that animals should be subject to these considerations of the good. Some people approach utilitarianism as essentially a calculus. You add up the sum of happiness and then you weigh it against the bad, and then you figure out what to do from there. And the other attraction to this is that it's objective. Every person's well-being is equally valuable. I can't give myself extra points if some action benefits me. It's not egoism. And so one of the other appeals is that it's an egalitarian view. Everyone's happiness counts the same. So if it's a question of, right, saving 10 people by sacrificing one, yes, it sucks for the one person, but given that 10 people's happiness counts more, it gives us a notion of fairness and impartiality. So again, not every consequentialist is a utilitarian, but every utilitarian is a consequentialist, and other non-utilitarian consequentialists would deny that happiness is additive or that individual well-being is equal. You could think that your own well-being is more valuable than others, but that puts you in the egoism camp. So one of the cornerstones of utilitarianism is what we call the greatest happiness principle. So this comes from some famous philosophers, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, among others, who formulate a very simple principle that utilitarianism takes to be the rule of thumb. It's that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether for everyone involved in a particular circumstance. In other words, that which produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people or individuals involved. And as I mentioned, there's two versions of this. Act utilitarianism is one, and act utilitarianism applies the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, which I just mentioned, to individual acts. An act is right if and only if it would produce as much good as any available alternative. So what act utilitarians do is they look at individual actions. So let's take a simple example. Let's take me throwing my water bottle at my friend. Now, I wouldn't do this. I can't imagine any circumstance under which I would do this. But let's say my friend has said something very offensive and I throw my water bottle at him, which I've never done. I'm not condoning violence, by the way. I'm just saying, using that as an example, act utilitarians would come in and say, well, Anthony, even if that gives you some pleasure, throwing your water bottle, the act of throwing your water bottle produces far greater net negative consequences or utility than otherwise. It would hurt my friend. It would destroy our friendship. They might have to go to the hospital. Even worse, right? It could cause very severe damage. So those consequences by that individual act weigh disproportionately against me throwing my water bottle. While I might argue that it gives me some pleasure, which I don't think it would, but in theory, I should not throw my water bottle because the net consequences are far more negative than positive, right? That would be a simple instantiation of act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarians take a slightly different approach. They apply the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle to a general rule. So an act is right if and only if required by a rule that is part of a system of rules that would produce as much good as any available alternative set of rules. So here's a good example of something that would separate act and rule utilitarians. Act utilitarians are generally fine with telling a lie if by telling the lie you spare that individual greater pain than they would have otherwise. Whereas rule utilitarians think, yeah, but as a general rule, we should tell the truth because by following that rule, we produce happiness over the long run versus the alternatives. So act utilitarians, as the name implies, focus on individual acts, whereas rule utilitarians look at rules that, when followed, produce the greatest amount of happiness over the long run. So one of the first systematic formulations of utilitarianism came from Jeremy Bentham, and he actually had developed what he called the hedonic calculus. And essentially what this means is I take any action that I'm thinking of and I can kind of measure it. Now, this might seem silly to us, but we got to start somewhere. And he thought that this is how we should conceptualize actions. We can talk about its duration, its purity, its intensity, its certainty, fecundity, extent, and then I can weigh some actions versus the other depending on the results from this calculus. So in other words, take me eating chocolate, right? That gives me some pleasure, but it's not very long, right? It's not super intense. It might even produce some overweight health problems versus instead of buying a bunch of chocolate, I could give the money to the Red Cross, right? So here I've got two different and competing actions. Buy $1,000 worth of chocolate, in which case I would be really happy, or I could give that money to charity. Bentham, trying to develop a calculus to determine what I should do, says, look, if you add all these things up, you should give the money to charity because the amount of pleasure that you're going to enact because of that action, Anthony, is going to be far greater. It's going to last longer. It's going to produce far more beneficial consequences over the long run for a greater number of people than just satisfying your dark chocolate craving, right? So there's a simple example showing how utilitarians have tried to come up with calculi for determining which actions we should undertake. Okay, so I'm going to ask you this in the discussion. This is the famous trolley problem, which came from two philosophers. You might have heard about this in a TV show, or I know it was in The Good Place. It's been all over. Maybe you've talked about it in psychology class. It's not a new thought experiment, but maybe some of you haven't heard it, but it comes from two philosophers from the 1970s, Philosopher-HER and Judith Jarvis Thomson. So if we applied utilitarianism to the trolley problem, right, this is something that's supposed to illustrate utilitarianism's appeal. So the setup is quite simple. There's a runaway trolley. You can see here on the upper right, you're standing on the side, and you notice on the tracks that there are 5 people tied up. You don't have time to save them, so just keep that in mind. And then over here, there's 1 person tied up. So the question is, if you don't pull the lever, the trolley will go down track A and kill the 5 people. But if you pull the lever, the trolley will divert from the main track and go onto this track, killing the 1 person, but saving the 5. So the question is, should you do it? Utilitarians think, look, the answer is quite simple. Pull the lever. It's maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. A version of this that's come out is called The Fat Man and the Trolley. That's not my wording. That's the initial wording for it. And it's actually very similar to some shows and movies that you might have seen. if you could push somebody such that their weight would stop the trolley, but it would kill them, should you push them, right? Some people say yes, some people say no, that they're somehow different. These cases are somehow different, but then the utilitarians are going to say, really, what's different about it in the end? If the goal is to save 5 people or to maximize happiness, then there doesn't seem to be any difference. Now, if you think all of this is silly and this is all a waste of time, I want to remind everybody that there are people working on this very stuff right now, programming self or autonomous driving cars. So you can actually go to some websites. I have it linked here. I can send it to you. And you can see that car companies like Tesla, Google's working on theirs, Waymo, I think is their company, where they're programming into the AI what to do in emergency scenarios, whether it should run over a dog to save a baby, right? Whether it should run into a crowded street. So we are programming this very kind of ethical language into technology right now. So it's not really that far-fetched. I know this sounds like who really cares about this, but this really does matter. We're seeing this technology develop in real time, which I think is very fascinating. So let's not be too dismissive. We want to talk about what our moral intuitions are in cases like this, in case we need to deal with a thorny moral situation, which happens all the time. Okay, John Stuart Mill is another famous utilitarian. He dispensed with the whole pleasures and pains being essentially equal. He thought that there were higher and lower order pleasures. So he thought, look, we have lower order pleasures, which are things like eating, having sex, things like that. And then there are higher pleasures like pursuing knowledge, taking a philosophy class, creating art. And so he has this famous line, better to be a human better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And what he means by that is ignorance is not bliss. It's better to go through life like Socrates, questioning and being unsatisfied with the answers than to just not care and roll around in the slop and eat and be ignorant of things. That's it in a nutshell. So he thinks it's always better to be someone like a Socrates who is constantly seeking out information and knowledge to seek out the higher pleasures, even if it means not always being satisfied with the lower pleasures. Okay, so again, there are lots of appeals of utilitarianism. It's intuitive. What else could morality be about other than consequences? Many people think it's very practicable, very intuitively plausible. It's goal-oriented, and many people believe adheres to our everyday notions of right and wrong. It's contextual. We can apply it to specific cases, and ethics is about making often difficult decisions, and often interests conflict in complex ways. So we need something impartial to help us adjudicate in those cases. And many people like the simplicity of it. It requires a small number of ethical assumptions, especially compared with rival theories. So those are points in their favor. Are there objections to utilitarianism? Of course. One possible objection to utilitarianism is if we're supposed to always maximize the happiness for the greatest number of people, then it seems like one consequence would be it wouldn't be morally permissible for me to go play tennis this afternoon if I'd be better off volunteering in a soup kitchen, because me playing tennis might maximize my own happiness, but it's not going to maximize happiness for other people. So in other words, if utilitarianism is true, we'd never be able to rest or enjoy anything because we'd always have to be maximizing happiness for everyone involved. There are responses to this, but that is one worry that comes up. Another common worry is what's called the utility monster objection. It essentially goes something like, imagine a monster that, gets a lot of pleasure from, the pain of other beings, right? It's a utility monster. But it seems like for a lot of people, that utilitarianism implies that there would be some number such that you could have bad things happen to people and have the net pleasures be greater than the net negatives. And that seems to many people to be counterintuitive, that even if, like in my earlier example, I get a lot of pleasure from throwing my water bottle at my friend, uh, that on utilitarianism, the amount of pleasure I could get theoretically would be greater than the amount of harm or pain that's caused to my friend. And for a lot of people, objections like this show that utilitarianism is implausible. Other kinds of objections include things like the justice objection. And so here, it'd be something like sacrificing an innocent person for the greater good. So this notion of a greater good comes up a lot with utilitarianism. If you could sacrifice one innocent person, but it would spare the lives of thousands of others, on utilitarianism, you have to do that. It's morally required. But for a lot of people, it seems to violate our deep-seated notions of justice. You could also take issue with Bentham's hedonic calculus, right? There have certainly been a lot of objections about that. Other worries include the standard of objectivity is too high or impossible, that we're never really able to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, or even conceive of how an action could maximize the greatest amount of happiness. And the other turnoff for a lot of people is that in utilitarianism, there's no consideration of intrinsic value. There's no action that's intrinsically good or bad. It's only good or bad relative to the consequences. For some people, that's very appealing. For others, though, it's not appealing, because many of us might want to say that some actions like murder are never justified, regardless of the consequences. It's intrinsically wrong. If maybe you share that intuition, maybe you don't, but a lot of people don't like that utilitarianism doesn't really seem to have the space to talk about intrinsic value. Another objection that is one of my favorites, it's called the nearest and dearest objection. It goes something like, let's say I have $10,000 to give, and there's a stranger who needs the money more than, let's say, my own child. According to utilitarianism, I should give the money to the person who needs it more over and above those nearest and dearest to me, because this person is far worse off than my own family. So I'm morally obligated to give the money away, even if I've promised it to my kids, right? If I had kids. So things like that are problems for utilitarians, critics say, because utilitarianism makes everybody equal. It's an egalitarian theory. So there's no room for prioritizing those nearest and dearest to you. Okay, we'll spend just a few moments on egoism. It's pretty self-explanatory. Egoism is another consequentialist theory that essentially says that in its ethical form, we ought always perform the action that maximizes our own self-interest. There are other kinds of egoists called psychological egoists. This is like Thomas Hobbes, who argues that we cannot help but always maximize our own self-interests. Psychologically, we just always search out and seek what's best for us. Ethical egoism is a normative account. This says that we should always perform the action that maximizes our own self-interest. So egoism is, very commonly held view that at the end of the day, we always have to look out for ourselves. There are plenty of criticisms of egoism. I'm not going to go over them here. I think one of the first and most obvious one is that egoism is implausible. It seems like many or most of us are deeply concerned with the interests of those we care about, and we're not just doing that for our own self-interested reasons. Some people disagree. They think science and modern psychology shows that we can't help but be self-interested, even when we think we're being altruistic, right? Selfish reasons. A lot of people hold that view. But there are other criticisms that can come in. But I think egoism at its most basic level is pretty self-explanatory. Nonetheless, it's another consequentialist form of or approach to ethics. So let me leave it there just to keep it on the shorter side. If you have any questions about any of this, please be sure to let me know. And thanks as always for listening.